Will Bijan Robinson live up to the hype? And how much more explosive will the Falcons offense be this year? And who exactly is going to start at left guard? We're answering all those questions and more on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by eBay Motors. A championship team is about each player being a perfect fit, and the same is true with your vehicle. So for the parts that fit, head to eBay Motors and look for the green check. Stay in the game with eBay's guaranteed fit. ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay guaranteed fit, only available to U.S. customers, eligible items only, exclusions apply. And guys, we thank you that for each one of you that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. Make sure you follow in the footsteps of the everydayer by following us on YouTube or subscribing on YouTube or following for free on whatever podcast platform you prefer. So yesterday on Locked On Falcons, we talked about the big question for the Falcons surrounding their quarterback position entering the season, and we'll continue the conversation talking about some of the big questions ahead of the Falcons, not only entering training camp, but also entering this season. And one of those big questions, continuing on the offensive side of the ball, once you get past the quarterback position, is the Falcons' biggest offensive acquisition this offseason in Bijan Robinson. And there's a lot of hype surrounding Bijan Robinson. The question is, will he live up to the hype? And the answer to that question is yes, but it kind of depends, right? Because if you've listened to this podcast, I'm sure some of you are a little confused by it, because basically 6 months ago on this podcast, I was hyping up Bijan Robinson as the second coming at the running back position. In the past couple of weeks, and especially the last couple of days, it seems like I've been throwing cold water on that hype train, especially last week when I talked about how if you wind up drafting Bijan Robinson very early in your fantasy drafts, he's probably not going to live up to that level of hype. And you're probably wondering what gives. And, welcome, dear listener, to the world of nuance. And yes, while I think Bijan Robinson will live up to the hype and be this incredibly impactful player when he's on the field, and there's going to be sort of that sense of electricity when he gets the ball versus other running backs, namely Tyler Allgeier, I also don't think the Falcons offense is going to be entirely geared around maximizing Bijan Robinson in the offense and getting him the most number of touches that you typically associate with the high-end running backs. And that stems from actually watching the Atlanta Falcons over the last 2 years and seeing exactly how Arthur Smith has utilized his running backs. And basically, as I would explain it and tried to explain it, but the simple way of explaining it is that the way that he's going to use Bijan and Allgeier is going to be very similar to the way that he used Cordero Patterson and Mike Davis back in 2021. And it was pretty clear early on in that season that that electricity, right, when it came to the offense, occurred when CP was in the game versus when Mike Davis was in the game. But it took until that week 4 matchup against Washington before you saw sort of the formal switch being flipped to where CP became the focus of the offense versus Mike Davis. And from that point on to the end of the season, it was kind of Patterson and Pitts as sort of the two offensive pillars that were the two most explosive and dynamic playmakers. Yet the Falcons continue to utilize Mike Davis both as a runner and receiver, with him getting nearly 40% of all the running back touches the rest of the season. And there's a reason why. And one of the reasons is that in order to better feature Cordero Patterson as this dynamic, explosive playmaker, the team needed to bring in Davis in the backfield to pass protect, right? And basically, it's the idea that it's harder for CP to be that dynamic, explosive playmaker if he's not releasing into routes, right? And The issue with that is you can't just basically bring in Davis just so you can throw the football, because you kind of tip your hand from a tendency standpoint to defenses, right? Defenses will note, oh, well, Mike Davis only comes in the game and the Falcons tend to pass the ball. And that's fine on third downs, but what happens if you want to, on early downs, right? You want to be a little bit more unpredictable in that regard. And so in that regard, you still need to kind of find ways to feature Mike Davis in the running game when he does come out there on the field, so that you don't become so predictable. And to me, this same dynamic is probably going to exist between Bijan and Allgeier, with Allgeier basically being the Mike Davis in this equation and Bijan being the CP. And you saw a similar dynamic between Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara during Kamara's rookie season, right? Kamara got plenty of work on passing downs, but only a small percentage of those resulted in him, staying in the pass protect, right? Now, if you look at that season, Ingram got nearly twice as many carries as Kamara did, and I don't think you'll see a similar thing between Allgeier and Bijan, but you will see a two-headed backfield, right? This is, the fact that the potential that the Falcons will be a two-headed backfield will be problematic for some people. And that was kind of what I was trying to explain on that previous episode. And it's going to be problematic for many people in the fantasy community, right? And it's going to be problematic to probably some Falcon fans that are trying to push certain agendas about this regime and this coaching staff and this front office not really knowing what they're doing. And it's not going to be a problem for me because, I don't really care all that much about, how many touches Bijan gets or whatever, just like I didn't really care about how many targets Kyle Pitts was getting last year. I didn't see that as a quote unquote problem, right? Now, I did care about the one touch that Kyle Pitts didn't get in the red zone that could have led to the Falcons converting in the red zone and potentially winning a one-score football game. I will care this upcoming season about the one touch that Bijan Robinson doesn't get, say, in a short yardage situation that could have converted and allowed the Falcons to continue a drive that would have allowed them to score in a one-score ball game. Those, to me, are the touches that we, at least on this illustrious podcast, tend to focus on, not the sort of volume numbers that I think the fantasy community tends to sort of focus on. So basically, that episode last week, as well as today's episode, is just kind of giving you a heads up that, as good as I think and others think Bijan Robinson is going to be this year, as well as in the future in Atlanta, this offense is not going to just basically be the Bijan Robinson extravaganza with select guest appearances from Tyler Allgeier. Bijan may have his name in the biggest letters on the marquee, but right below him, you're going to see Tyler Allgeier's name in pretty big letters as well. So they both will be featured. At least that is what I perceive to be the plan. We always know that, everybody has a plan until they get punched. So, there are unknown variables like injuries and whatnot that could change the plan once we get into the regular season. But I think week one, in a world where you say Bijan gets 13 touches, Allgeier gets 11 touches, and CP gets 7 touches, some people are going to be sitting here scratching your heads like, I don't understand what's going on. And I'm just basically giving you guys a heads up that, if you shouldn't, if you've been paying attention to the Atlanta Falcons and how Arthur Smith runs his offense, that shouldn't be a head scratcher for you if that day winds up coming. So that's kind of what I want to do. Bijan will live up to the hype, but it's not going to be entirely the Bijan Robinson show. So we'll talk about, his ability to live up to the hype and how that's going to help the Falcons become a more explosive offense as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp, and you guys have heard me talk about how therapy has benefited me over the past year, and that's thanks to BetterHelp. Therapy has helped me understand that you can only control what you can control, and, I can't control if the Falcons win a football game. What I can control is the quality of this podcast, and I've gotten a lot of feedback over the past year that many of you think the podcast has improved, and that's thanks indirectly to BetterHelp. And sometimes in life, we are faced with tough choices, and the path forward isn't always clear. Whether you're dealing with decisions surrounding your career, relationships, or anything else, therapy can help you stay connected with all the things that you want to navigate in life And if you're thinking of starting therapy, I can't recommend BetterHelp enough. It's entirely done online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire and you'll get matched with a licensed therapist quickly. And you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Let therapy be your map with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So another big question facing the Atlanta Falcons as they head into training camp in this upcoming season is, can they be more explosive, right? And this has kind of been one of my biggest questions for the Atlanta Falcons ever since Arthur Smith's arrival back in 2021. And it's been one of my more consistent criticisms of Arthur Smith is that his offense hasn't been as intentional as I would prefer when it comes to generating explosive plays. And what that means is, while explosive plays do happen in this offense, it's not necessarily consistently always because of the design of the play, right? When you look at the play and you're like, oh, they dial up this to attack this coverage or this weakness in the defense, right? More often than not, they're Falcons explosive plays, and this is not something exclusive to Arthur Smith in Atlanta, but also was an issue for him, if you want to call it that, an issue in Tennessee, was the offense is often just get the ball into the hands of your playmakers and let them do their thing. And in the past, I have called this basically let your dudes be dudes, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that Arthur Smith has never designed explosive plays. It just means that it's not a strength of his offense. I wouldn't call it a weakness either, but it's not necessarily a strength of his offense. And you contrast that with Kyle Shanahan, where it is a strength of that offense, and the Arthur Smith offense is based off of the Shanahan offense via Matt LaFleur. And Kyle Shanahan was very intentional, if you could argue surgical, with his ability to dial up explosive plays, not only here in Atlanta when he called plays, but also in San Francisco, which is why he continually gets touted as one of the best play callers in the NFL, much to the chagrin of Falcon fans who understandably have some baggage with Kyle Shanahan. But with Arthur Smith, I am open to the idea that he is better in this area this upcoming season, because I think overall he was a better play caller in 2022 than he was in 2021. I think he can be a better play caller in 2023 than he was in 2022. And I think this is one of the bigger, if not biggest, misconceptions that I often come across with fans, is this sort of false belief that coaches, upon being hired by NFL teams, are supposedly or expected to be these kind of fully formed entities. And the reality of coaches is that they're human just like the rest of us are. They're just like players in that they can grow, adapt, and evolve over time. And if you've recently checked out the Play Callers podcast series that was recently presented by Jordan Rodriguez of The Athletic, then you're probably a little bit more familiar with that idea. But while I may not necessarily be super optimistic that Smith is going to show considerable growth in this area, I'm at least open to that possibility. But I think the thing that we'll discuss moving forward on today's episode is what happens if Arthur Smith doesn't show that growth, right? That he doesn't necessarily improve upon his ability to add intention and design in terms of explosive plays, and his offense continues to be mostly just guys being dudes, so to speak, right? And I do think because of the weapons like Bijan Robinson that the Falcons have added this offseason, they should be more effective, being more explosive just from guys being dudes, right? We talked already about, how their dudes in 2021 were Cordero Patterson and Kyle Pitts. And I think in 2023, that's going to be primarily Bijan Robinson and Kyle Pitts. Those to me are the two guys that are most capable of being dudes. And it's not to say that nobody else on this roster won't make big plays or won't sort of be dudes from time to time. But, usually when we're talking about dudes, right, we're talking about Derrick Henry. We're talking about A.J. Brown. We're talking about guys that I'm just bigger, stronger, faster than you are. And, the person that's trying to cover me, the person that's trying to tackle me, Julio Jones was a dude, right? Derrick Henry was a dude. A.J. Brown was a dude, all that stuff and more, right? So, I think we'll see explosive plays from Drake London. We'll see explosive plays from Mac Hollins and Scotty Miller, Jonnu Smith, Cordero Patterson, Tyler Allgeier, all those guys, right? They will certainly generate chunk yardage on those explosive plays. And we'll see, we'll continue to see kind of what I would call basic, I don't know how else to describe it, like plays that every offense has, like sweeps and screens and end arounds and digs and fades and go balls, right? And we'll see those guys generate those chunk plays on those types of play calls. But part of the reason why, like I say, like everybody has those plays in their offense. And when those are being your explosive plays in Arthur Smith and they form a large chunk of his explosive plays throughout the years, that's what I mean, where it's like it's not really intentional. Like he didn't cook up a specific play or whatever. So I think we'll see plenty of those guys on those quote unquote basic plays, generating those explosive plays. We've seen plenty of those guys in the past, whether it's here in Atlanta or else in Tennessee, generate those explosive plays in Arthur Smith's offense. And so, we'll just see how much more of it we'll get. Again, I have confidence that the Falcons will be more explosive this year than they have been to date. The question is just how explosive they're going to be. Are they going to be a team that can get into the upper echelon of the league in terms of explosive plays, right? If Smith is kind of the same as what he has been to date, when it comes to this stuff, I still feel like the Falcons should be middle of the pack, sort of top 15, 20 range, right? In terms of being an explosive offense this year. Now, I think if Arthur Smith can also, in addition to that, like basically, I think we have enough dudes that we can be middle of the pack, right? But if Arthur Smith also takes a step as a play caller, I think that's going to get you into the upper part of the league, right? And I think that potentially changes what this Falcons team in 2023 and beyond's potential ceiling can be, right? For example, if you just look at explosive pass plays, 20 plus yard pass plays from 2022, the New York Giants, who made the playoffs, were dead last in the NFL with 28 of those explosive pass plays, right? The Falcons were only a few spots above them with 37, right? Ranked 30th in explosive pass plays. Now, if you look at the other 13 playoff teams, 12 out of those other playoff teams beyond the Giants had 50 or more explosive pass plays. And so that ranked in the top 18. And there was a big chunk of those teams from like 12 to 18. And then there was another jump where you had teams like the 49ers and Jaguars that were 7th and 8th respectively with 56 and 55. You have the Chiefs, Eagles, and Dolphins that were 1, 2, 3 last year in explosive pass plays with 73, 63, and 62 respectively. So basically, I feel pretty confident, right, to put a number on it, that the talent alone should be able to get this team, from 37 that they had last year to, let's say, closer to 50, right? Closer to that middle of the pack number, right? And thus make this team a playoff caliber type of offense. But I think Smith's play calls can be the thing that takes it from 50 to potentially 60, right? And the closer that you get to 60, the greater the potential that, the Falcons aren't just a team that is just happy to be there in the playoffs, assuming that they're in that position and gets bounced in round one of the playoffs, but a team that can legitimately make a deep postseason run, right? And, on the flip side, it's also possible that I'm wrong and the Falcons continue to be near the bottom of the league with explosive plays. And, that potentially means that the Falcons go back to the drawing board next offseason. And we're spending a lot of time talking about, their need to add more, explosive speed on offense, particularly at that wide receiver position. But I do think we'll probably be talking about that in 6 months, but it's just going to depend, how the season goes, how loud we are about that 6 months from now. So that's a big question that I think certainly needs answering. Another one that needs answering is who will be the Falcons starting left guard come week one? Is that going to be Matthew Bergeron or Matt Hennessy? We'll answer that question as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, I want to give a special shout out to the everydayers out there that tune in each and every day to this illustrious podcast. Tomorrow, we'll probably flip sides and talk more about the big questions entering the defense. And of course, if we're talking about the Atlanta Falcons defense, we got to talk about the pass rush. And I know there's at least one listener question talking about, should the Falcons be more invested in, signing a pass rusher and then say a Corey Davis type of player. I'm sure you were wondering how I would get him into the conversation. You were like, oh, he didn't talk about getting Corey Davis in order for the Falcons to be more explosive. I don't think he's not going to bring up Corey Davis on today's episode. Well, I got you, ladies and gentlemen. The everydayers know that I will find somewhere to get it into the podcast. But let's wrap up today's Locked On Falcons talking about that left guard competition. And, that's kind of the big starting competition that we have, the lone starting competition that we really have on offense, and one of basically two starting competitions, I think, nickel cornerback being another one entering training camp. And the question is it Matthew Bergeron? Is it going to be Matt Hennessy starting at that left guard position? And, I'll reiterate what I have said throughout this offseason. I think Matthew Bergeron will probably win the competition, but I don't think it's going to be automatic. Like going into camp, I feel like, there's like a 75% chance that Bergeron is the week 1 starter at left guard. But probably if you had asked me this question, 2.5 months ago, immediately after the draft, I probably would have said it's a 90% chance that Bergeron is a starter. And that decrease is not necessarily a reflection or, the idea that I have less confidence in Matthew Bergeron, that, Matthew Bergeron isn't very good or Matt Hennessy is much better than I think. It's just more that, in late July, I have a little bit more of a grounded perspective going into the summer, while, immediately after the draft, you're like riding high on the hottest takes, stemming from the draft. But, I do think Bergeron's ability to win that competition is going to be a reflection of his NFL readiness. And we know that this coaching staff is not going to necessarily throw rookies to the wolves, because they kind of learned that lesson not to do that from the last time they tried starting a rookie at left guard in Jalen Mayfield back in 2021. And I know that leads to some frustration among fans, because, many fans complained about, why isn't Richie Grant on the field in 2021? I know many fans complained about last year's draft class not necessarily getting as many reps early in the season as they would have preferred. Desmond Ritter's probably top of that list in terms of guys that people wanted to see hit the field sooner versus later. It's not necessarily something I spend a ton of time dwelling on. I certainly have opinions on who I think should play, no doubt, but generally I give the people in the building, like the coaching staff and the front office, the benefit of doubt that, they probably know a little bit more than your random person on Twitter or X, if you're going with Elon Musk's dumb ideas, but that random person that has like 73 followers, like, I don't know if you probably have as informed an opinion as Arthur Smith has on who should be playing, or Dean Pease or Ryan Nielsen or whatever that is. But I think if Bergeron is ready to go, he should win the competition. If he's not ready to go, then I think this regime is comfortable with rolling with Hennessy in the short term. That's due to Hennessy being in the system for 2+ years. That is due to the fact that Hennessy did start 3 games at left guard last year and played reasonably well in those 3 games. Right now, because of the ability to roll with either Hennessy or Bergeron moving forward, this competition in training camp is not nearly as compelling as we often find ourselves, at least to me, going into training camp, right? Like usually when we're talking about a starting competition, we're like, oh, this is a big battle. We got to figure this out. But like, I feel pretty good about either option, Hennessy or Bergeron. So I'm not that invested in sort of who wins the competition. Yes, I am invested in Matthew Bergeron getting on the field, potentially sooner versus later and turning into a good pro. But, my confidence and optimism that the Falcons offensive line is going to be fine if that doesn't happen immediately this season is at an all-time high, right? And that's thanks mostly to Dwayne Ledford, right? I think it's in this team's best long-term interest that Bergeron gets on the field and begins his development towards hopefully being one of the better starting guards in the NFL. But I think in terms of like the immediate impact on the field in 2023, I'm not sure Bergeron versus Hennessy starting is going to make this massive difference, right? I think both players will have their ups and downs, their highs and their lows this season if they are this starter, right? Because Bergeron is a rookie, and because I think he has more upside, the potential is he will have higher highs than Matt Hennessy, but because he's a rookie, he might also have lower lows, right? While Hennessy might be more of a steady Eddie in the conversation. And so I think at the end of the day, both will be mostly solid and be able to get the job done this season. And that's funny to me because if you listen to this podcast 3 years ago, I said, vehemently said that, I didn't think Matt Hennessy had much of any chance of being an effective starter as a guard in the NFL. And now the fact that I'm, 3 years later, I'm like, I feel good about either option says a lot. It basically says that Dwayne Ledford is a hell of a drug. So we'll see how this competition emerges. This first week seems to be sort of indicative often how the rest of the summer will go when it comes to past offensive line competitions. You look at last summer, we saw that left guard competition. Jalen Mayfield, got the first team reps on day 1 of training camp. And then day 2, Elijah Wilkinson took over and never looked back. Then you contrast that with the competition between Hennessy and Drew Dahlman, the Falcons starting center, at the center position last year. And they basically, rotated each day who was going to take those first team reps. So I suspect we'll see Hennessy get those day 1 first team reps because he's the veteran. But at some point, potentially in that first week of training camp, I'm hoping and expecting to see the Falcons kind of toss the keys to Matthew Bergeron fairly early on. And so that will give him his opportunity to win that competition. So while I'm not going into camp building up this competition to be sort of the make or break battle that's going to determine the trajectory of the Falcons offensive line and their running game, right? I imagine when we get to these daily podcasts here on this illustrious podcast, and we're talking about daily practice reports, this is probably going to be a position battle that we give frequent updates to. It's like, oh, well, Bergeron got first team reps, Hennessy got first team reps, that sort of thing. So that kind of wraps up our questions about the Falcons offense. Tomorrow we'll flip the script and talk about some of the defensive questions, which means, we have to talk about whether or not the Falcons finally have a decent pass rush, which, after Desmond Ridder is probably the second biggest question that this team has. We'll get into a listener question about whether or not the team should be looking to bolster their pass rush with current free agents as well. But to summarize today's episode, if it's not clear, when it comes to Bijan living up to the hype, I think, yes, he will, but I also don't think that means that Tyler Allgeier is going to be an afterthought in the offense. I think the Falcons will be more explosive this year in line with a playoff team, right? And I also think Matthew Bergeron will probably emerge as the starting left guard for the Falcons this year. But of course, sometimes, once a decade, I get stuff wrong, and we'll see, if I'm 3 for 3 or, 2 for 3 or whatever. But can't be 1 for 3. That's definitely not going to happen, right? Yeah. Anyway, I was trying to think of something arrogant I could say at the end of the podcast, but I'll just leave it at that, guys. Appreciate you for making us your first listen. Continue to do so on tomorrow's episode when we talk about the defense. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL podcast, as well as the daily shows on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, ATL Day Ones, Hitting Hard, all that part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.